One of the theological testimonies that I think intrigued many people at the time of the Second Vatican Council was Karl Rahner's, I think it was him, designation of Christ, or perhaps also of grace, as God's self-disclosure. Most of you, I'm sure, are familiar with the many self-help groups and their variety of approaches to communication, and perhaps self-disclosure is one of the ways that a group bonds more quickly than by any other factor. I had an experience this myself when I was an abbot. After a few years, some of the brothers thought I might be helped by a communication workshop. Self-disclosure is simply the truth about ourselves. And there's literally nothing that makes you more lovable to other people. I discovered this at this workshop that I went to. I think it was in 1968. It was the National Training Laboratories, and it was a popular movement of the time, the NTL, I think it was called, and T groups. And it was originally designed to help these, the CEOs of corporations to be a little more human or a little more humane, as the case might be, with their employees and their boards and such things. So I innocently went to this event. I think it was on the grounds of the University of New Hampshire. And we started out with a group of about 12. Nobody knew who the other people were or where they came from. And one of the aspects of the process was, it was the common agreement not to tell anybody who you were or where you came from. So I gave my name. I think I gave the right name. In those days, I hadn't written any books, so I wasn't too well known. And you were supposed to give your occupation. Well, in those days, priests were still considered sacred territory, and the last place you'd expect to find one was at a tea group. But there were quite a few there, incognito, including myself. So I represented myself as the manager of a large farm in Massachusetts. Well, we actually had a large farm, and I was president of the Abbey's corporation, I guess, legally. But I didn't quite look like a farmer, at least to some. But they didn't question it, and we didn't know each other's occupation until after about a week. And so each period there were these intense interchanges where the high priest of the tea group, who was somebody trained to do this job, he happened to be an Episcopal priest, actually, but he didn't tell anybody either. But he was very good at it, very down to earth, and each night someone, I guess by the time we got that far, would be placed more or less on what is known as the hot seat. Well, that's where everybody tells you their unvarnished opinion of you and your behavior, personality, and so on. And there's no danger of them being bashful because they don't know who you are. And at the end of the event, everybody goes home. Well, some of the people had an enormous tragedies in their life, and they would be, I think it was kind of a caricature to say, as used to be said, well, they spilled their guts and so on. But it was a lot more than that. These people were really suffering. All of us were suffering. And the more that each one revealed their personal difficulties and weaknesses and disappointments, the more everybody loved them, the more they were welcomed into the group. So in 3 days, this group bonded together more profoundly than any group I have ever known, family, peers in school, or anything else. It's extraordinary because it was designed to allow you to feel your own emotions without any need and there was a lot of encouragement to let go of your defenses and so. So some people were incredibly frank. And I remember one young man, he was what I would consider an example of the all-American boy. He didn't have any faults. He was just a superb human being. And these other people kept pummeling him. Well, there must be something wrong with you, was implied. But he held his ground. And he just was a great guy. He didn't have the usual problems. He just liked everybody automatically. There was one lady who told us with tears, and oh, this would go on for hours. We were all a wreck at the end of each evening. How she would wake up in the middle of the night, it was only 5, and hear her mother and father screaming and yelling at each other and threatening to get a divorce, and all she could think of was of being torn apart because she loved each one, and she couldn't bear to think of their being separated. So she went around the circle, and there were various tricks of this trade, I guess. And she was allowed to say whatever she wanted to anyway. Well, most of the group, I would say, would be in their late 20s or 30s. I was probably the oldest. I think I was around 48 or so at the time. Well, anyway, this lady, when she came to me, sat in my lap. And she wasn't about to move. So I forget, the tea group leader and so on, they were talking and asking her how she felt and so on. Well, she was obviously seeing in me, I suppose, a father figure, if my psychology is correct on this. And I guess I was. Eventually, with this help of the leader of the group, she moved on to other contacts around the land. Okay. Well, I never experienced such an emotional high as this technique was able to provide. It was just, I don't know what to compare it to. It was just as though this kind of universal love for each other, and it was, to me, it was directly related to the weakness or need of the people and their proportion of their self-disclosure. I was learning a lot from this. Well, it was wonderful to see how people really experienced you without any role whatsoever. And it had been quite a while since I had been in such a free situation. Because, the abbot has a role, and people were certain to relate to you, and same with authority figures. You can't really be one with everybody unless you have some means of laying aside the usual defenses for roles and fears of being rejected or being opposed if you threaten the authority figure and all that stuff. So I was keenly aware that I was being treated as a father figure. And towards the end of this, we were sitting around in a circle, and the exchanges were going on and so on. And a gentleman who was a physical therapist, I think he did deep massage work, that sort of thing. He started eyeing me kind of funny. And all of a sudden, he leapt out of his chair and came rushing over and started to shake me like this. And I nearly lost my head. Everybody was aghast. And being a good Christian, I couldn't think of what to say except, thank you. Well, this was just the end for the other participants. By this time, they'd found out that I was a Christian, I guess, because I forget all the details. But that was the worst thing I could possibly have said, because then everybody said, there's a typical Christian thing. He comes out of the Middle Ages and have no sense of standing up for their rights. In those days, you know, self-defense was a virtue for the first time in centuries. So with the level of emotions, I could feel utter rejection from the group. This guy is just, a goody-goody. Meanwhile, this man had left marks on my shoulders that remained for a month, black and blue. And even the leader said, are you sure you're not having a heart attack? No, it really hurt. So then they had, as they often have in these things, some way where I could get back into the good graces of the community. Well, you might think after this that if I had any sense, I would have walked out. If you're thinking that, it shows how little you understand the power of a T group. Because you've bonded so deeply, your whole emotional system wants to maintain this bond and to enjoy the visible and emotional acceptance by everybody. So a very closely knit group by this time. So he, the leader, came up with this great project. All of the other members of the group would stand in a circle, shoulder to shoulder, arm to arm, leg to leg. And that if I wanted to get back in the good graces of this group, I had to get in the center somehow. Looked impossible. Well, I had such a desire to belong to this group by that time. I suppose if I had a chance for a little centering prayer, I could have chosen something else. But the love for this people was so great. Well, how am I going to get at 48 into this closely knit group? So I tried to get over the top, and I circled around, and they just got tighter and tighter. They completely rejected me. So then I got the idea. I sort of backed off and ran towards this group. I grabbed two people's shoulders and gloriously slid under their feet into the center of the circle. Okay. They all changed instantly, covering me with all kinds of hugs and kisses and welcomed me back into the group. They were thrilled at how I'd risen to the occasion. So the tragedy of that kind of workshop is that nobody understands what you went through when you get home. Nobody's going to join you in this bonding process where you share self-disclosure at that level in that concentrated way. Now, and that's realistic. So there's enormous letdown to that kind of group. But the reason I give this example is to emphasize what the power of self-disclosure is, and that what God has actually done is to subject himself to a T group, so to speak. In Jesus Christ, God, at least in our Christian faith, has come down from heaven and joined, maybe not the group at the University of New Hampshire, but everybody in an exchange of honesty in order, by his revealing himself, to invite us to reveal ourselves to ourselves and to God and perhaps to others. In other words, this is a experience of who are you. In a T group, it's largely limited to your emotional life and so on. But what God has tried to do in Jesus, it seems to me, is to manifest the inner dispositions of ultimate reality, if you're interested. And this ultimate reality is also an ultimate mystery. So the parables of Jesus, then, rightly understood, are the self-disclosure of God through Jesus as the Son of God's bosom, who is telling us how God feels about things, insofar as in God there is something equivalent to such things as feelings. That the fascinating thing about self-disclosure is, if it's done in the right place and with the right intention, it causes everybody to experience solidarity in weakness, in human powerlessness.